We're going to talk about diabetes, what it is, symptoms, and ways to manage it. So, what is diabetes? So, diabetes is a chronic, which means it's long lasting disease that affects how the body turns food into energy. And there are three main types of diabetes. So, we have type 1 diabetes. So, this is sometimes also referred to as juvenile diabetes. It doesn't necessarily mean that you only will get it as a juvenile or as a child, but very often it is diagnosed at a young age because it is an autoimmune. Sometimes you'll see people a little bit older being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, but it's for the most part diagnosed in a young age. And there are many symptoms that are associated with that sometimes parents will bring their children to the doctor for, and they'll usually check their blood sugars. And the diagnosis is pretty simple, just based on what their blood sugar numbers are. There's type 2 diabetes, which really used to be diagnosed much later on in life. A lot of the times it's associated with obesity, morbid obesity. Mostly it's with visceral fat, which is like more fat that's around the stomach area. And there's a very strong correlation between that visceral fat and type 2 diabetes. We usually would see that diagnosed later on in life. But unfortunately now, with all of the fast food so readily available and pretty inexpensive, we're just seeing the diet kind of shift to be a little bit more unhealthy at a really young age. And so we actually are seeing type 2 diabetes as well as obesity and morbid obesity at much younger ages, which is becoming a very big problem. We're hoping to teach nutrition education to parents with young children so that they can work on their eating habits to prevent that. And then the third one is gestational diabetes. And this is a diabetes that only comes out during pregnancy. It usually goes away after pregnancy once the baby is delivered. And about 50% of those who do have gestational diabetes are usually prone to develop diabetes, type 2 diabetes later on in life. It's not always the case, but half of the time is the case. So a big complication of unregulated blood sugars is CKD, or chronic kidney disease. So there are different stages of CKD. It can start off pretty slow, stage 1, and then it can very quickly progress to stage 5. And if we continue to have these uncontrolled blood sugars, it can progress fairly quickly. And kidney disease is definitely something that we want to try to prevent, especially if we can, with controlling our blood sugars, because there's a lot of maintenance like dialysis and things of that sort that can really take over our lives and quite literally life-changing. More than 37 million adult Americans have diabetes, so that's a very large number. From 2021 to 2022, the number of adults diagnosed with diabetes has more than doubled in the past 20 years. And a very large reason for that is the American diet. Diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States. So again, this is not like, hey, we have diabetes, we're automatically that leads to death. But what's important to note is because there are so many people with diabetes, as long as we're controlling our blood sugars and being healthy about it, we can live a very long, healthy life. And we can even revert back to becoming pre-diabetic or completely lower our A1Cs and be considered to not have diabetes anymore. And as long as we're keeping our blood sugars at bay and really being healthy about it, we can really live a long, beautiful, healthy life. So it doesn't necessarily mean, hey, this is going to happen to me. It's just an important reminder that we really do need to keep our blood sugars within, a good limit. So how does it work? So we eat food, right? So our bodies break down into glucose, and glucose is another word for sugar that is released into the bloodstream. The glucose in the bloodstream increases our blood sugar levels, right? So we eat our food, the glucose from the food is released into our bloodstream, and that raises our blood sugars. Pretty simple. When this happens, we have our pancreas that releases a hormone called insulin. And what insulin does is that can help use the energy we got from food by allowing glucose into our cells. And then this decreases blood sugar levels. So that insulin is what takes that glucose to bring it into our cells to allow us to use energy, which is why it is really important that we do have glucose. We do need glucose. We need carbohydrates, right? We don't need the simple carbohydrates as much, but we need these complex carbohydrates, which are fruits, some vegetables, more starchy vegetables, whole grains, things like that. Those are all, we do need that in our diet because that's what's going to go to our cells and be converted as energy with the help of insulin. Type 1 diabetes is developed when insulin is not produced, or if it can't do its job, which is type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is when the pancreas is not producing the insulin, and type 2 diabetes is when we have insulin, but it's not able to do its job. It's not able to take that glucose and bring it to our cells to convert it to be used as energy. So when the blood sugar levels are too high, these are dangerous long-term complications. So type 1 diabetes, it's an autoimmune disease, and this means that the body is attacking itself by mistake. So some people may have other autoimmune diseases. A lot of the time, autoimmune diseases are very much connected to our thyroid and other hormones that have to do with our thyroid. And so typically, there's no way really of controlling autoimmune diseases. They happen kind of by itself, and the body is really just attacking itself by mistake because it's viewing like almost what we have inside of us is like foreign. In this case, the body, it does not produce insulin. And for this reason, individuals with type 1 diabetes have to take insulin every day. It's not enough to take these diabetes medications. We need to actually take insulin because our body is not producing it. About 5 to 10% of people with diabetes have type 1 diabetes, mostly common to be diagnosed at a young age. Type 2 diabetes, it's the most common, and it makes up about 90 to 95% of diabetes cases. So really the majority of diabetes cases are type 2 diabetes. And this is the result of insulin resistance. It's not able to do its job. And when the cells do not respond normally to insulin, so the pancreas makes even more insulin, but it fails to regulate blood sugar. So our pancreas is doing its job. It's producing insulin, but it's not able to go to those cells. And so we actually have a lot of insulin building up in our pancreas, but it's not being released. And this type develops over time as a result of factors and lifestyle choices like diet and exercise. There's a very strong correlation between diet and type 2 diabetes. So it's very important to really understand that and take note of that. Then we have gestational diabetes. This develops in pregnant women who have never had diabetes before. And then this can create health problems during pregnancy, but usually goes away once the baby's born. But having gestational diabetes does increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life. It doesn't mean necessarily right after the pregnancy, but later in life, there is a higher chance of developing type 2 diabetes. So what are some common symptoms of diabetes? So sometimes we may not know that we have diabetes, especially children, right, who have type 1 diabetes. What are some things that parents should look out for? But even type 2 diabetes, what are some things that we should be saying like, this is maybe a little bit not normal, feeling very thirsty. So it's not just like, hey, I feel thirsty. It's feeling really extreme thirst. It's not just a regular thirst. It's really thirsty, feeling like you just need to drink all day for the most part. Going to the bathroom, really peeing more than usual. And a lot of the time it's really because we are drinking a lot, but it's also not only because we're drinking a lot. Our body is just constantly producing urine. Feeling very hungry, very tired, because what happens is when we have a lot of blood sugar in our blood, it makes our blood very goopy. It takes a little bit longer to get through our bodies. So it makes us feel a little bit tired because it's not getting oxygen as quickly. Slow healing wounds. So if we get like some sort of like big scratch or scrape on us, it takes a much longer time to heal. And losing weight without trying. How can we diagnose diabetes? So there's something called HbA1c testing. When we get our bloods taken at our doctors, they're typically going to check our A1C levels. So this is a blood test to measure average blood sugar levels over the past few months. It's usually over the past 3 months. And this helps to determine a diabetes risk. So we see this number here, 5.8. So that's like in the pre-diabetes range. So we're not yet at diabetes, but if you see that number of 5.8, we may need to tell ourselves, hey, I need to change what I'm doing in my lifestyle. I need to either be more active, I need to work on my diet, things of that sort. And when I say diet, I don't mean actual like a fad diet. I mean what we're eating, how we're eating as a lifestyle, not just, hey, let me stop eating and diet now. So A1C is between 5.7 and 6.4 are considered to be pre-diabetes. This range is pretty subjective. Some doctors use a little bit of a different range, but this is for the most part broadly used, but you will see sometimes a little bit of a different range. And then type 2 diabetes, so levels above 6.4 may lead to a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. So usually 6.4 or above, or really above 6.4, they will say, okay, we're in that pre-diabetes range. So what are some long-term complications? Obviously with type 1 diabetes, it's important that we take insulin every day. So for type 2 diabetes, there's actually a lot of ways we can manage it, but what are some long-term complications if we don't take care of our blood sugars? So memory loss, it really does affect our mind. Heart disease, it's coronary heart disease is like one of the number one complications. Nerve damage, very common we see with diabetes that's not well managed. Vision loss really affects our eyesight. kidney disease and foot problems. We'll see a lot of foot ulcers on the feet. And unfortunately, because of nerve damage and foot problems, we see people needing to amputate their feet or their legs or other limbs because of complications from diabetes. Not to scare anybody, but this is really just a wake-up call that it is so important to manage our blood sugars and make sure that we're staying at healthy levels. So what are some things that we can do to manage our diabetes? So let's talk about first prevention. So physical activity, right? It is so important to be physically active for so many reasons, but staying physically active will really help keep the blood sugars moving out of our blood. Proper nutrition, right? Making sure that we're eating properly. We're eating well-balanced meals every single day, well-balanced snacks every single day, making sure we're getting enough protein, enough complex carbohydrates, enough fiber, right? Fiber is very helpful in helping making sure that our blood sugars are moving through our bodies quickly. And then management. So there's prescribed medications, right? People are on metformin and other medications to help keep our blood sugars in that normal range. We also have insulin therapy. As I mentioned, most people with type 1 take insulin, and some people with type 2 also take insulin therapy. It may just be a better fit for them. I will say that the management of diabetes is very individualized and it's not a one size fit all. So management may look very different for everybody, which is why it's very important to go to an endocrinologist and make sure that they're properly being watched over. So the glycemic index, this is a value of foods based on how they affect our blood sugar levels. So we have medium, high, and low. And this is very helpful as a tool in type 2 diabetes to make healthy choices that support a stable blood sugar. So we have things that have a high glycemic index, or things like white bread and cookies and cupcakes and waffles and beer and ice cream and things like that. Things that have a medium glycemic index are things like kiwi, coffee, pineapple, bananas. And a low glycemic index are usually things that are pretty high in protein and also really have no carbohydrates. So like mushrooms and cucumbers and, oranges, because there's a lot of fiber in there, and strawberries, a lot of fiber. So things that usually are high in fiber have a lower glycemic index. Things that are a little bit lower in fiber usually have a high glycemic index. So this is just an important thing to look up, and very easy to find the glycemic index of a food. So high GI foods, GI stands for glycemic index. This spikes blood sugars. They're usually high in carbs. It includes things like breads, oatmeals, pastas, potatoes. When we eat the skin of a potato, it will lower that a little bit, the glycemic index. If we don't, it's a higher glycemic index. Watermelon. I always tell people that about watermelon. There's very little fiber in watermelon. It's great for the summer because of its high water content, but it is very high in sugar. So it's important to note that as somebody who has diabetes. Medium GI foods are moderate in carbs. They include beans, mangoes, bananas, pineapple, peaches, whole grain rice, sweet potato. Even the flesh are a little bit lower of a glycemic index than regular potatoes and corn. And then low GI foods stabilize blood sugar, and they're very low in carbohydrates. These include vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, berries, yogurt, chicken, fish, steak, eggs, nuts, etc.
Is diabetes genetic?
There's very much a genetic component to it. There are some people who really do everything they can eating wise and very physically active, and it's in their genes, and there's really not much we can do about it. But it also does not mean that you're definitely going to get it.
I think one of the things that is so interesting from just my perspective about diabetes is that there is that potential to improve, right? And to do preventative things that can actually make your blood sugar better. So there's things that you can do in a way that isn't always the case with other diseases.